Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 56. I am the show's host, Kyle. Today's show is going to have some very important current events. So if you are listening to the show and want other people to know these current events so maybe they could adopt some of the same truth that we all know, please share today's show. You'll find the podcast at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or on my Facebook page, Kyle Files. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we're going to get right into the news. The first news I want to talk about is the new authorization for use of military force will be voted on in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee tomorrow. That will be Thursday, June 22nd. I've talked about this resolution a lot in the past, but now that it's coming up and it's really going to start moving through Congress, I think it's something that we should narrow in and focus on. The committee, I'm not sure if we'll be able to get the committee vote. I was trying to look and see if I could watch that committee hearing, but it did look like it's going to be a closed hearing, which means that we definitely won't get it up on C-SPAN or be able to stream it online. So maybe one day down the road we could watch it, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be easy to access. What happens does that mean? We will find out if it passes or fails, or if it gets postponed. Sometimes if a vote like this isn't going to go through, they will postpone it. So I will definitely update this on Friday. The new authorization for use of military force will repeal the 2001 and I believe 2002 authorization military force, and those were the ones used to fight the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Obama then expanded, and Bush also expanded the meaning of the 2001 authorization for use of military force to carry out strikes against groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Syrian rebel groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Gaddafi in Libya, and several other targets like Pakistan. The U.S. has even supported to some extent the Philippines fighting the ISIS-linked group in Mawari. This new authorization use of military force will allow the president to, search and destroy for terrorists linked to Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, or I believe ISIS were the three groups mentioned. The Taliban may have been mentioned too. And this would give the president the authority from Congress to conduct all ongoing wars in the Middle East, except for maybe what they're doing in Syria against Assad, and in Yemen supporting Saudi Arabia's wars against the Houthis. The Houthis are not linked to Al-Qaeda and actually fight Al-Qaeda. Same with Assad, where he's fighting the groups that Congress is voting to authorize the U.S. fight against right now. I mean, this is, again, just a part of the absolute insanity of American foreign policy. On one hand, we have Assad here, right, who's the leader of Syria, who it does still have popular support, even at least a plurality of the Sunni population of Syrian support. While Assad is not a great guy, he does fight against the people that America hates most, the jihadists, al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, the other Free Syrian Army linked groups that also swore loyal to either al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda, and they also fight against ISIS. And so rather than just jumping on board and being like, well, we're at least going to not impede Assad's advancement against the jihadist groups because those are our worst enemies, the U.S. is interfering and attacking Assad. Likewise, we have the same problem with Iran, where the U.S. has definitely at least allowed their Israeli allies to carry out airstrikes against Hezbollah targets within Syria. The U.S. has hit some of these Iranian-backed militias within Syria, and at the same time, Iran is supporting militias in Iraq that the U.S. is also supporting, and so this completely arbitrary line in the desert is deciding what groups the U.S. supports, and in Iraq that happens to be the Iranian-backed groups, and in Syria at times it's ISIS. And so this new authorization for use of military force will certainly allow the U.S. to continue to conduct a lot of war. This also expands the reach the U.S. could conduct war. There has even been, to some extent, some jihadist support in Latin America. I believe actually there were quite a few ISIS fighters from Trinidad and Tobago who ended up going to fight ISIS. So we could see the U.S. war on terror really expand from, right off the Florida coast all the way around the world to the Philippines. Whereas we know the Philippines government is battling against an ISIS-linked group there. And you may say to yourself, well, the Philippines government will absolutely never allow U.S. troops within the Philippines to fight against ISIS, but Assad and Gaddafi both would have said the same thing, and the U.S. In the case of Assad, it's just completely ignoring him and fighting at times for ISIS, but also against ISIS, against Assad's will. And so I don't think the native country not wanting the U.S. to fight the jihads there will prevent it from happening. Of course, we also had to look at the problem that passing this resolution will not only give the president the powers that this authorization has, but also expand it in any way possible. Of course, the 2001 authorization of U.S. military force pretty explicitly just gave the United States the ability to fight against Al-Qaeda-linked groups within Afghanistan and the Taliban. Unfortunately, the language was not explicit enough, and the U.S. has had used that resolution or that bill for 16 years now to fight terrorists all over the world, drop bombs in countries like Libya, very far away from Afghanistan. It has nothing to do with Afghanistan, but the government still uses it for that. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities that the U.S. government would use an authorization to use military force like this one to say, oh, well, these are terrorist groups, Iran-based groups that we consider terrorist groups, so now this allows us to attack Iran or something along those lines. It's an extremely dangerous bill, and hopefully it gets defeated. The only kind of good part about this bill even coming up is just it does, to some extent, delegitimize the current uses of military force, especially the 2001 that's being used. This bill is kind of saying that, hey, we have to put this new one in place because the old one you're using is outdated. It really doesn't cover what you're doing right now. We want you to keep doing what you're doing right now, but you need a little bit more authorization to do it. Obama always insisted that the president had the authority, he never said where, but the authority to carry out these strikes no matter, if the Congress gave them authority or not, even strikes against Assad. Of course, Obama then took up a vote, told the Congress that they could hold a vote for a resolution that the United States should go to war with the Syrian government and Assad, and the people said no. And so maybe this could be another one of those moments with this authorization of use of military force. If the United States government would decide, or if the people of the United States would decide that, hey, we're voting on this war right now, and if this vote doesn't go through, then the war can't go on, then that would obviously be a good thing. And I think we at least have a little bit of an opportunity to hope for that right now. And anytime it comes up, at least it's another opportunity for us to inform people. And so that's that authorization of use of military force. We have another issue kind of on the table, and that is the strikes and the actions that the Trump administration is carrying out against Assad. Of course, we've had 4 or 5 incidents now, different incidents where the United States has directly intervened in the Syrian civil war on behalf of the rebel groups and directly against Assad, whether it was shooting down the Syrian plane, bombing Iranian-backed militias trying to chase ISIS, or carrying out strikes against a Syrian air base. All of these times what the United States has done has had some kind of negative impact in the Syrian civil war against Assad. And so there's a lot of question what legitimacy is the executive branch using to carry out these attacks. What kind of authority do they have to do this? And it's really hard to find one. And so we actually had a Democratic representative calling for a vote on a war in Syria against Assad. This seems to be a support by the senator because he was going on about how evil Russia is and how Trump needs to realize how evil Russia is. Of course, for Wolf's part, he completely fails to ask any kind of, clarifying questions like, hey, you're calling for a war against Syria or against Assad in Syria. Won't that benefit ISIS? Isn't that a problem for the United States? But those kind of questions, of course, never come up. Yeah, we gotta just, keep our eyes on a lot of different wars and interventions going on right now. The United States government is really headed in that direction. The Trump government has the media all up in arms, and none of them could focus on any real story for any amount of time because they're all focused on this Russia business or that Russian business. In the meantime, the U.S. is shooting Syrian planes out of the sky, and there's a lot more important things going on in the world. One actual important piece of U.S. and Russian news, and that is that a U.S., spy plane was flying in the Baltic Sea, and then a Russian fighter jet came within 5 feet of the U.S. plane. I don't know if the measurements are right, or if the pilot said, whoa, that guy was like 5 feet away. And, we all know that like 5 feet away could really mean 100 feet. It just means like kind of close for comfort based on what's going on at the time. So if I'm in a plane and anything's within a couple thousand feet of me, it's, way too close for comfort. So I guess it just depends on what your standard is there. And I don't know, 5 feet seems a little ridiculous to me, but that's what's being reported. Of course, the mainstream media, Wolf Blitzer included, is like, what do we do about these Russians flying their planes so close to our American planes? But the American planes are flying really close to Russia, and that's the problem. I mean, I know this goes both ways, and at times Russia will fly their planes up and around the Alaska area to kind of, send like a little threat to the United States. But when the United States is constantly flying these missions over the, Baltic Sea and around the Russian border, it's gonna create problems, and the Russian planes are absolutely gonna try to go and chase the American planes off. I would expect America to do nothing less against the Russian planes, and so this isn't like a provocative act of war on this side of the Russians, and for anybody to think so, and for Wolf Blitzer to completely uncritically ask and talk about this like it's some sort of act of aggression on the Russians' behalf is completely unacceptable. Coming from North Korea, we have two stories, one in the United States, and that is the college student that was returned to the United States from North Korea has passed away. There is some now question on maybe if he was awake and talking at one point. A lot of people are speculating on what happened to this kid. I've seen a lot of people saying that the North Koreans probably beat him, to death, and then he was in a coma, and then they sent him home. I really don't know what happened. Maybe they'll be able to do an autopsy to determine, but he was in North Korean custody for a long time. Just judging by how the North Koreans treat their people, I doubt this American, political hostage got very good treatment, but we'll wait and see. I guess I would just suggest everybody not jump to too brash conclusions on this one to think that, he was tortured or anything that may not have happened. Maybe it did, but maybe it didn't. Keep an open mind until we get like some autopsy or something. The other news coming out of North Korea is that the U.S. flew a couple nuclear weapons capable bombers over the Korean Peninsula in a show of force to North Korea. I do believe this happened after the United States, after that college student died, so maybe it wasn't a little bit a sign against the North Korean government for that, but it's always hard to tell as to why Trump would do something and why all of these just absolutely crazy things are happening in the world right now. Like there would need to be U.S. nuclear capable bombers flying over these places. Of course, as I brought up before, the big question mark and the big problem with North Korea is it's kind of tucked into a little area there right in between Russia and China, and shares a little bit of a border with Russia and a big border with China. And so anytime you hear that the U.S. is flying nuclear capable bombers over South Korea, just remember that those bombers are also flying really close to Russia and China. And I'm sure that doesn't make Russia or China very happy, just like the United States isn't very happy when Russia flies their planes up around Alaska. And every time we just have to remember how this is perceived on the other side of the issue as well. A few stories coming out of Africa. First, the South Sudanese government that was, of course, kind of structured by the United States and Hillary Clinton, and the leader was put in place, and they are now carrying out civilian killings. We're having stories of every time government soldiers get killed, then they will go out and kill some villagers who are part of the same ethnic group as the soldiers that killed the Syrian or the South Sudanese government soldiers. And as we can see, that no matter what the United States does to try to intervene in South Sudan, every time it just leads back to genocide. And what are you going to do? There's so many refugees pouring out of the country now. Everybody's trying to escape because it's not safe to live there for a civilian. In Nigeria is another area. In the northeast of Nigeria is one of the areas that's facing famine. Of course, there's about 5 of those areas now in the world. This area, I believe, has 4 to 5 million people in that area that are facing famine. Only about half of the government food aid that's trying to go up that way is getting there. A lot of it has to be diverted. Terrorist groups and jihad Islamist groups are a problem in this area. Boko Haram operates in this area, and so this is just another part of the problem of what do you do whenever all these conflicts start and whenever you tried all this nation building and colonialism in Africa. What happens when everything falls apart and now the people are starving to death? An Al-Qaeda linked group attacked a mostly used by Westerners resort in Mali. At least 4 people were killed in the attack, 3 civilians and 1 soldier. Portugal reported that 1 Portuguese soldier was also killed in the attack, and that might put the death toll in the attack up to 5. But this again is just another example of the consequences of the Libyan war. This is a revolution that has spilled over into neighboring Mali, and now civilians are being targeted in hotels used by Westerners in that country. In Somalia, a car bomb kills at least 10, possibly 15 in the capital of Mogadishu. This likely was Al-Shabaab, although I didn't see an official claim of credit yet from Al-Shabaab. Again, U.S. interventionism, mainly under George Bush, but also a little bit under Clinton and under Obama, has led to a string of situations in Somalia where Al-Shabaab controls a big chunk of that country. That chunk of the country is where about 4 million people are starving to death. Moving to Afghanistan, we have 8 members of the Afghani military killed as they were trying on, or at least en route to an American position. Looks like the Taliban carried out those attacks in the northeast of that country. As far as it goes with Afghanistan, John McCain has even come out and said that the United States doesn't have a plan in Afghanistan. John McCain even realizes, and now I guess that's saying something, but at the same time he supported the war in Afghanistan the whole way along. So, I mean, he's guilty for the situation that we have right now in Afghanistan. Absolutely, John McCain, you have to own it, and if you have a problem with it, say, my fault, I made this mistake, let's try to fix it and see if we could get our troops to come home. Of course, I'm sure that's not his solution. Retired General Daniel Davis says that the 4,000 troops that the U.S. has proposed to send into Afghanistan will not be enough to turn the tides of the war. And so this is just, kind of what we've been talking about, that even though adding these 4,000 troops is something, largely is just going to prolong the stalemate and drag out this already very long, very deadly, very bloody war. Moving to the Persian Gulf, we have a couple confrontations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I detailed last week I believe maybe even on Monday, how a Saudi border patrol boat opened fire on 2 Iranian boats, killing 1 fisherman. Now we have Saudi Arabia claiming they captured 3 boats belonging to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard says these aren't any sort of special boats, they're just fishermen, and you got it wrong, and you're trying to do some grandstanding on the international stage. Honestly, either story could be true. Neither side would necessarily have any incentive to tell the truth here. We did have the terrorist attacks that occurred in Tehran, and Iran did blame those terror attacks on Saudi Arabia, so it could be Iran looking to strike back. On the other side of it, Saudi Arabia, this is something they would certainly lie about to score political points against Iran, especially in this critical time where the Qatar situation is going on, and we have Jared Kushner flying over to Israel, I believe, to try to work out a deal between the Qataris, the Saudis, the Bahrainians, and the Emiratis. And so there's just a lot going on. It's hard to know what's truth and what's fact, but that's the situation. Those are the narratives coming out of there. In Mosul, ISIS is down to holding only the old city. As I believe I said on Monday, there's between 100,000 and 150,000 civilians in the city, depending on what reports you listen to. A lot of those civilians are children. We had General Dunford explain what the United States' role in fighting ISIS now is. He explained that what the U.S. is trying to do is push ISIS into little pockets and then take them all out there. I guess in the past, one of the problems that the Trump administration had with the Obama administration's tactics against ISIS was that Obama was, for example, letting the ISIS militants flee from Mosul and maybe headed towards Syria, Raqqa, or Tel Afar. And so the General Dunford said the strategy is now to get them all in one place and then take them all out. The problem is now you have about estimated 300 ISIS fighters left in Mosul with 100,000 civilians. You're at kind of needle and haystack levels where one option to find all the needles is to set the barn on fire and let everything burn down and then pick them all up, or to try to pick them out. It seems nearly impossible without the Iranian government taking a lot of losses there, so it's going to be a real problem trying to get that last little bit of Mosul. And, the General Dunford's strategy that the U.S. is now using, you could kind of see the problems in other areas as well, where we have a population center of Raqqa now, where there's a lot of ISIS fighters and a lot of civilians there. It's going to be very hard to get them out. Other news out of Mosul, 2 journalists, I believe one French and one Kurdish journalist, were killed in the city by an explosion. I just bring this up to detail that even once ISIS is kicked out of the city, the people of Mosul are far from being out of the woods. ISIS stashed explosives everywhere. I'm sure there's IEDs all over the city. I'm guessing that they're doing the best they can to find disarm all of them, but it's not always possible to do that. There's also issues that a lot of the ISIS fighters have blended in with civilians and left the city or left the ISIS controlled areas of the city. So now can they come back and attack the city as a civilian? Very dangerous. A lot of problems. In Syria, the first thing I want to talk about is an article by Nancy Youssef that ran on BuzzFeed. Very good article talking about how the stage in Syria is kind of changing the way it's being set. In the past, you had pretty much everybody just picking on ISIS. However, ISIS has lost a lot of ground in Syria, and it's getting to the point where now you have the U.S. SDF forces coming in contact with the Syrian army a lot. And even in other areas, you have SDF forces coming into contact with Syrian rebels and having conflict there. And so now it's not as much ISIS being the focus enemy, it's the other groups being the focus enemy. The most clear example of this is what happened in the fighting for the city of Jadin. I brought this up last time. This is a story of the Syrian fighter jet being shot down, but what happened, just for those of you who didn't catch it, you had SDF forces kick ISIS fighters out of Jadin. The SDF forces took 2 main injuries and had to retreat back to, I guess, a nearby city. In that time, the Syrian Arab army, Assad's army, started advancing on the city. The Syrian jet then carried out bombing raids against ISIS, trying to move back into the city. Originally, this was disputed by the Americans, saying that the Syrian fighter jet was attacking the SDF forces, but now the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that the Syrian jet was actually attacking ISIS. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights tends to have a bias towards rebel groups and against Assad, so this seems to validate what Assad's saying, and on that part of it, it seems to be truthful. But again, always hard to know what's going on out of the middle kind of area of Syria there. A U.S. jet then goes and shoots down the Syrian fighter jet. Of course, this would have probably slowed the advance of the Syrian Arab Army's troops towards the city, allowed ISIS to get to the city faster. If the city is controlled by ISIS, then the SDF forces could go back in and kick out the ISIS fighters again. If the city is controlled by the Syrian Arab Army, Assad's forces, then it's going to create a lot of problems for the SDF, because then they would directly be fighting Assad for the city. Some of the fallout from the shootdown has been a hotline between Russia and the U.S., a kind of a deconfliction hotline for Syria. Russia says that they have halted that. It doesn't sound like they've closed the hotline, so I guess if the U.S. still had an emergency, they could call and get a hold of Russia through the hotline. The U.S. says that it is looking to reestablish a hotline with Russia, whatever that means, and if Russia is willing to do it, they're going to say, yeah, you got the hotline there, but you only call us to tell us you're shooting down our jets or something like that. Part of Russia's response has also been to say that they will treat any U.S. planes entering into Syria west of the Euphrates as targets. I don't know if this has happened yet. The U.S. shot down an Iranian drone in southern Syria earlier. I believe that occurred yesterday, and I'm not sure if that jet then had to cross into Syria to carry out the attack, or maybe it was able to do it from Jordanian airspace, but the jet certainly didn't get shot down or targeted, fired upon by any sort of Russia anti-aircraft within Syria. The U.S. has said that the U.S. pilots will defend themselves over the skies of Syria, and did not seem to indicate that they will stop carrying out missions west of the Euphrates. As I predicted on Monday, Australia has pulled back and said that they are suspending their part of coalition operations within Syria, obviously because of the tensions that the United States created with Russia. And so just getting back to where I started with the coming defeat of ISIS, with ISIS losing territory, the Syrian Arab Army, the Iranian-backed militias, and then the US-backed rebel groups and SDF, YPG forces are going to come into contact more and more often. The more they come into contact, the more dangerous and the more chances that we have for escalation between the ultimate backers of each side, the United States and Russia. This is certainly reminiscent of the Cold War and very dangerous. Last news coming out of Syria, the city of Dara, which is in southern Syria near the border with Jordan. I think it might have actually been one of the first cities taken by the Syrian rebels, is once again under attack by the Syrian government. The Syrian government had declared a 48-hour ceasefire that started on Saturday, but I guess that ceasefire has fallen through. Oh, one more story out of Syria, and that is 17 children have been paralyzed with polio in Syria. And so this is just another cost of the war. Very frequent concept I talk about on the show is the cost of war and how there's all these hidden costs that nobody ever thinks about. Everybody just thinks it's going to be dropping a few bombs, killing a few bad guys, and everybody's coming home happy. But whenever you wage a war like this, like we did in Iraq and then in Libya and now in Syria, you lead to situations where a disease that really shouldn't be impacting children at all has now fully paralyzed 17. Quick story out of Yemen, that is 20 civilians were killed by a Saudi airstrike in open market in Sana'a. Just goes to show how little the Saudis care about the Yemeni civilians, continuing to rack up the civilian deaths in that country. Not only do you have people starving to death, dying of diabetes, dying of cholera, and then on top of everything, the Saudis will drop bombs on open markets. The Western media puts the death toll at 20. On Twitter, I've seen reporters like Nasser Arabi estimate that the number is 25 plus. I think he tends to be right because the Westerners typically only got the bodies that make it to the hospital. Alright, that'll do it for today's show. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Let's keep up spreading the show. It is making a difference. It's good news. We have a lot of important news stories coming out, and people need to be informed about the new wars that Congress is trying to start, because the media obviously isn't going to talk about it. I am on Twitter at KYAAALE. My personal website is kylesfilesblog.com. The Facebook page is Kyle's Files. The private Facebook group is Foreign Policy Focus. You can find all my work also at libertarianinstitute.com. Thanks everybody for tuning in.